Hello, tributes, and welcome to episode 6 of Ashes of the Hunger Games. Before I start, just a few, pre-episode shenanigans. First of all, I changed up the way that I write these little summary videos. You'll see what I mean when I get there. But I've added summaries of some of the pre-games events that are held. Um and again, you'll see what I mean when we get there. But anyways, I'd also like to thank a few people, give credit where credit is due. I'd like to thank Andrew McLean for making some of the art used in this video. I'd also like to thank Christian Blanco and Lauren for writing Tales of the Hunger Games and Panem Reborn respectively. Without them, this series would not exist. Anyways, good luck, tributes, and may the odds be ever in your favor. After last year's premature ending due to tributes all wanting to just get the games over with and thus hiding close to each other, the capital was glad that Rhea didn't win. One thing they did realize, though, through these games, though, was that they couldn't argue with the fact that they needed more female victors. Luckily for the capital, they were about to get one. This year's victor was 18-year-old Aluma Bates from District 1. Aluma was the twin sister of last year's victor Alumo Bates. She was not a very well-liked figure within District 1, mostly because of how cocky she became after Alumo's victory the year prior. Although these facts all had the entire district plotting against her, she remained calm and stoic during the reapings. After no one volunteered, Alumo was forced to pick a female name from the reaping bowl. The rigging of the bowl was immediately evident as Alumo picked out the name of his twin sister. The pair embraced each other tightly, not wanting to say goodbye to each other. Meanwhile, the male volunteer ceremony went on as planned, with a 15-year-old boy named Price Prince being picked to represent District 1. During the visitation period, Alumo was thankfully allowed to visit Aluma, considering that these were the last reapings he had to perform. Although he was technically Price's mentor, Alumo had told Aluma that he wouldn't give Price any unfair advantages against her and the other tributes. This gave hope to Aluma, but before the pair could finish chatting, peacekeepers immediately forced Alumo out of the room and in order to start his mentoring duties on the train. Eventually, Alumo was also forced out of the room and onto the train. On the train, Alumo's favoritism towards Aluma was immediately apparent to Gleam and Price. Gleam ended up taking over the mentoring duties for Price, being disappointed in Alumo. During training, Price and the other careers immediately exiled Aluma. The only two careers to actually like her were the District 2 girl and the District 4 boy. This pair were part of a new insurgence of wheelchair tributes due to the Wheelchair Accessibility Pact of 3249. This year, four wheelchair tributes were there to represent their districts. These four tributes were Katie from 2, Cirquette from 3, Cirque from 3, and Carter from 4. Katie and Carter were actually not allowed into the Career Alliance this year due to the disadvantage of being in a wheelchair in the games. But Aluma, on the other hand, was quick to offer an alliance to all four of the wheelchair tributes, which they gratefully accepted by all four tributes. During the training assessments, Aluma threw swords at targets and hit almost every single one in the bullseye. This gained her a score of 11. Other notable scores were those of Katie from 2 with a 10 after after her impressive show of musical talent. Although this wasn't a skill that could help her in the arena, she was still a firm favorite, along with Aluma. Also, Carter from 4 was also a high scorer, scoring an 8. This score was lower than some careers, but higher than most. The interviews took place the next night, and Aluma stood backstage wearing a tight-fit red dress that hugged her figure perfectly. She was the first tribute to get interviewed, and as she set foot on the stage, cheers were heard from the Capitol crowd. Some of the people in the crowd even fainted at the sight of her. Even Tia had to find her composure, finding Aluma just as attractive, if not more attractive, than her twin brother Alumo. Aluma's interview did end up being a little more on the average side, but she was still loved by many people in the crowd. The next day, the tributes were taken to the launch room underneath the arena, where tributes surprisingly weren't given arena clothing and were just expected to wear what they had been wearing before. Aluma had already been dressed in an oversized hoodie and some shorts. Eventually, Gleam came in to visit Aluma. She told Aluma that although the favoritism that Alumo had for Aluma was obvious, she still wished Aluma luck. Before Aluma could say anything, though, Gleam pushed her into the tube and the glass closed around Aluma. Gleam then watched as Aluma put her hair up in a ponytail as she was lifted into the arena. This year's games took place in snowy slopes. The weather was a major avalanche. The games lasted for 5 days, and the notable mutts were friendly Arctic foxes. When the podiums rose into the arena, the cold immediately started to get to some of the tributes, especially Aluma and Price. Both of them had their arms crossed over their bodies and were shivering, trying to warm their body temperatures. When the gong sounded, Aluma immediately ran for the snow coats and grabbed 5 for all 5 members of her alliance. She then ran to the sword and grabbed one, immediately decapitating Lioness from 2. She then ran over to her allies, giving them their coats, and then running away from the cornucopia with her allies behind her. When they thought they were far enough away from the cornucopia, they paused to take a break. Aluma sat down and next to her allies and told stories of her life back in District 1. Most of her more interesting stories had her twin brother in them. She herself wasn't really that much of an interesting figure within District 1. This caused Katie and Cirquette to both comment that maybe this experience would give her more stories to tell if she made it out. After a few minutes of this, the group heard something nearby. It was a twig snapping. It didn't sound like a tribute had caused it, though, so the group decided to investigate it. As Aluma was up front, she was the first to see what caused the sound. What had snapped the twig was an Arctic fox, which had collapsed to the ground after being injured by the couriers. The group immediately picked up the fox and took it back to their camp. Over the next few days, they would feed the fox and nurse it back to health. After the fox was healthy enough to do so, the group even took the fox hunting with them. After an avalanche had taken Katie, Cirquette, and Carter on the 3rd day, the alliance was down to just Cirque, Aluma, and the fox. Meanwhile, the avalanche had also taken down a considerable amount of the career alliance. More notably, it took down the muscular Kitty from 10. After the avalanche, during day 3, there were still 15 tributes remaining. These tributes did include Aluma and Cirque, along with the remaining careers, which did include Price, and a handful of solos. On the 4th day, as Cirque and Aluma were playing with the fox, Price and Bassa from 4 found them. Price immediately lunged at Aluma before his sword could pierce Aluma, though. Cirque rolled in the way and took Price's sword deep in his side. He then yelled for Aluma and the fox to run, but Aluma and the fox stood defiant. As Price tried to take his sword out of Cirque's side, Aluma and the fox took action. Aluma went in and stabbed Bassa in the forehead, immediately sounding her cannon. Meanwhile, the fox bit into Price's leg and wouldn't let go. After Aluma finished off Bassa, she ran at Price and stabbed him in the no-no zone before cutting it off. This caused Price to scream louder than anyone present thought he could. In order to get him to stop, Aluma sliced her sword across his neck, sounding Price's cannon. Just as she looked over at Cirque, he fell out of his wheelchair. Aluma and the fox knelt down next to Cirque and tried to comfort him through his obvious pain. Having used all the medicine they had been sponsored on the second day on the fox, it turned out Aluma and the fox would be there until Cirque's cannon sounded, having bled out from the wound caused by Price's sword. On the dawn of the 5th day, it was down to the top 5. The top 5 included Aluma from 1, Skylar from 5, Rory from 5, Fox from 10, and Hopewind from 12. At this point, the remaining 5 started walking towards the cornucopia. The group was a surprise to the capital, as the pair from District 5 were both soloists, along with Aluma now. Meanwhile, Fox and Hopewind were some of the weaker careers this year. As Aluma walked towards the cornucopia, she told the fox to stay at the camp, so as to not be hurt during the final battle. Unbeknownst to her, the fox followed her to the cornucopia. As Aluma arrived at the cornucopia, she witnessed Skylar killing Hopewind. Then she saw Fox running at Skylar and almost immediately avenging Hopewind's death by killing Skylar. Before Aluma ran out, however, she noticed Rory sneaking up on Fox out of the corner of her eye. She also noticed the Arctic fox her alliance spent all games becoming friends with coming up to her. Aluma rolled her eyes externally, but on the inside she was happy she had found a loyal friend, even if it was an animal and not a human. Just then, she witnessed Rory getting the upper hand, killing Fox. Aluma then ran at Rory. The pair fought for a long while. Rory even managed to stab Aluma in the gut, but eventually Aluma got the upper hand with the help of the Arctic fox and decapitated Rory, making Aluma the victor. After winning the battle, she fell down to the ground. Just then, the Arctic fox came to be by Aluma's side. Aluma pet the fox, and she muttered that she was going to name the fox Arthur. As Aluma went in and out of consciousness, Arthur sat beside her, nudging her awake whenever she'd lose consciousness. After being taken out of the arena, Aluma spent a whole 6 months in hospital, going through surgery after surgery to fix the deep wound in her gut. This process took so long that Aluma's victory interview was also cancelled, along with her victory tour. Victory tour posters already made were recalled, and only a few collectors still having them. After her month in hospital, Aluma returned home to District 1, where, to Aluma's surprise, Arthur was already there waiting for her to return. According to her twin brother Aluma, it was a hard process to adopt Arthur for her, but he did it for her. This resulted in Aluma hugging Aluma tightly. Aluma would then go on to live a quiet life in District 1 with Arthur. Eventually, Luma would actually marry Gleam, apologizing to her for the favoritism. The two would then go on to adopt 5 children together, 4 girls and 1 boy. None of their children would go on to compete in future games, and the Backrock family would grow to be one of the happiest ones in District 1. After last year's female victor, the capital wanted more female victors. This year's victor was a bit of a surprise due to the fact that she had the lowest training score out of all the tributes in a measly 4 after failing to start a fire. This then caused her to get kicked out of the Career Alliance. This year's victor was 16-year-old Aphenia Allard from District 2. Aphenia was a prominent figure in her district, being the niece of Mayor Dalton. Aphenia is a feared student within the Dalton Elite Training Academy, being one of the best performing students there. This year, Aphenia was one of the 29 girls to volunteer for the Hunger Games. This was Aphenia's 3rd year in a row volunteering, having started volunteering for the games at the age of 14. She won the volunteer games relatively easily this year, striking fear into the hearts of most girls, causing them to rip off their own bracelets. At that point, there were only 4 girls left in the volunteer games. Aphenia would then slowly find the remaining girls and bash their heads against the ground until they went unconscious, and she'd then rip their bracelets off. After Aphenia was crowned the female tribute for District 2, she watched the male reaping games until a 17-year-old boy named Aries Gonzalez won the male tribute spot. During the visiting period, Aphenia was visited by her husband Helvius. Helvius told Aphenia that he believed in her and that she definitely had what it took to win. This brought a smile to her face as she kissed Helvius on the cheek before being taken out of the room. Helvius embraced and kissed Aphenia. On the train, Aphenia and Ares looked between each other in anticipation of who might start a fight, considering that the past 2 years had both tributes from at least 4 districts fighting each other. This occurred until Maximus and Callista came into the main train compartment. The pair successfully got Aphenia and Ares to trust each other a little more. During training, Aphenia hung out with Ares, alumni from 1, Will from 1, Carmen from 6, and Chuck from 10. The group excluded the tributes from 4, 7, and 12, along with the girl from 10, considering they were relatively weak compared to the normal careers. Carmen and Aphenia developed the closest relationship, considering they were both going through similar problems, as they were both waking up with sickness in the morning. Meanwhile, the boys and alumni came up with theories about why the girls were going through that. The consensus was that Aphenia and Carmen were pregnant. During the training evaluations, Aphenia tried to start a fire, failing to do so, most likely because of the lack of certain factors needed to start a fire within the training center. This gained Aphenia a training score of 4, which surprisingly got Ares to stop communicating with her when the group saw her training score later that night. The interviews took place the next night, and Aphenia stood backstage in a golden dress with tears in her eyes. It had been revealed during alumni's interview that her and the other careers were kicking Aphenia and Carmen out of the Career Alliance due to both of the girls supposedly being pregnant and therefore weak, along with Aphenia's low training score. Before Aphenia was set to go on stage, Carmen came up to her and asked her if she still wanted to ally with her, to which Aphenia agreed. After this, it was Aphenia's turn. Her interview was relatively normal until she got up from her seat and declared that she was going to do whatever it took to win and walked elegantly off the stage. The next day, the tributes were taken to their launch rooms underneath the arena. Athenia paced back and forth in her launch room, unable to think clearly, just trying not to cry. Eventually, Callista came into the room. She immediately apologized to Athenia about how Ares had treated her after the whole training evaluation score reveal. Athenia accepted the apology, stating that Callista had done nothing wrong. Callista then hugged Athenia and kissed her on the cheek before watching Athenia step into her tube and smiled as Athenia was lifted into the arena. This year's games took place in a train. The weather was a downpour of rain, the games lasted for a week, and there were no notable mutts. As the tributes were lifted into the arena, they realized they were on a train platform with a train coming. Just then, President Vesta's voice boomed into the arena. Vesta stated that tributes must get what they need from the cornucopia and get on the train before it leaves the platform. Whichever tributes didn't make it onto the train would have their trackers detonated. When the gong sounded, Athenia ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a sword. Immediately, alumni also grabbed a sword and attacked Athenia. Athenia then proceeded to show the careers it was a bad idea to kick her out of the alliance by decapitating alumni. Athenia then grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of oranges, while Carmen grabbed a bottle of water and some apples. The pair then ran onto the train with many minutes still left before the train left the station. Immediately, Athenia and Carmen felt the heat of the train. As the day went on, tributes would strip down as far as their decency would allow. When the night arrived, though, the outside got freezing cold, and so the train activated some heating. Because of a malfunction in the arena, the heating actually made it hotter than it was during the day. This malfunction caused many tributes, including Athenia and Carmen, to strip nude in order to combat the heat. Although the game makers insisted that this wasn't on purpose, the citizens of the capital loved what was happening because of it. When Carmen stripped, she couldn't hide the fact that she was pregnant anymore, considering she was due any day then. As she said this, Athenia felt bad and stated that she'd do whatever it took to save Carmen from the arena. Meanwhile, in the capital, citizens were outraged, begging for Carmen to be removed from the arena. President Vesta didn't let head game maker Leviathan Alphaed do this, though, and Carmen stayed in the arena. The next day, Athenia got sick when she woke up in the morning, throwing up over the side of the train as it moved over a bridge. Carmen held Athenia's hair back as she did this. When Athenia was done, they saw someone approaching through the window of the compartment right next to them. Just then, Millie and Miller, both from 9, ran into the train compartment. The pair looked terrified of Athenia and Carmen. Millie was literally shaking in fear. Carmen looked at Athenia, wondering what to do. Athenia and Carmen surprisingly did nothing and let the pair turn around and run the other way. After this, Athenia and Carmen would sit down together, and nothing else really happened that day. That night, Athenia and Carmen cuddled together as they slept. As the days went on, the number of tributes continued to go down until day 5. On that day, something else unexpected occurred. On day 5, Carmen's water broke. As the experience occurred, Athenia tried to help Carmen birth the child, whom they had both talked about in the nights between. After a few minutes, Athenia successfully retrieved Carmen's baby. That night, the pair were sponsored with a baby carrier. Carmen then put the baby, who the pair had named Carlos, into the baby carrier. On the dawn of the 6th day, the pair were attacked by Will and Aries. The career pair tried to kill Carlos, but Carmen stepped in the way of the attack, protecting her precious baby son. When she did this, she ended up being stabbed in the heart. Carmen looked back at Athenia with a heartbroken smile before collapsing and her cannon sounded. Although Carmen had died in the attack, Athenia successfully single-handedly fended Will and Ares away from their camp, killing Will in the process, therefore avenging Carmen. That night, Athenia held Carlos close and cried herself to sleep. On the dawn of the 7th and final day, Athenia woke up to the train stopping at a platform. This platform was the same platform they had started the games on. It was revealed that after Wolf from 10 and Oak from 7 snuck up on Ares and killed him last night, it was down to the top 5. The top 5 consisted of Athenia from 2, Zeno from 3, V from 5, Oak from 7, and Wolf from 10. Athenia was the first off the train. She climbed up on top of the cornucopia with Carlos's baby carrier and stayed up there with him. At her perfect vantage point, Athenia could see Wolf and Oak killing Zeno in one of the train compartments, while V ran out of the train and hid somewhere in the cornucopia structure. Just then, Oak ran out of the train, having seen V run out here a few seconds ago. Just then, V jumped out from behind a box and ran at Oak, slashing his throat open with her knife. V then raised her hands up in victory before a sword embedded itself into V's back. This sword was thrown by an angry and vengeful Wolf as he ran out of the train, looking for his final opponent. This is when Athenia struck, jumping down from the cornucopia and running at Wolf. Wolf immediately lunged for V, grabbing his sword out of her back, stabbing it back into her neck before taking it out again for good measure. Wolf then swung his sword at Athenia, cutting her stomach. Athenia screamed and clutched her stomach in pain, but continued to fight. Eventually, after 5 minutes, Athenia got the upper hand and cut Wolf's arm off. She then tackled Wolf to the ground and stabbed him in the face again and again and again until his face was completely unrecognizable. After Athenia's victory was announced, Athenia immediately climbed back up on top of the cornucopia to check on Carlos. Only after making sure Carlos was 100% okay did she let peacekeepers take her out of the arena. After her victory, Athenia went home to Helvius, where the pair of them eventually found out that Athenia was indeed pregnant, and that the wound to her stomach wasn't deep enough to injure the baby. Grateful for this realization, Athenia and Helvius had one more thing left to do after having their daughter. 5 years after Athenia and Helvius had their daughter Zenobia, they went to the capital. Here, Carlos was in an adoption agency, waiting for someone to adopt him. When Athenia visited him, he immediately recognized her and ran to hug her. After a few more months of visits, Athenia and Helvius officially adopted Carlos. The pair then went on to have 3 more children together, 2 girls and a boy. The pair wanted to have at least 4 children together, including Carlos and Zenobia, so that Carlos and Zenobia would have at least one sibling of the same gender. After adopting Carlos and having her children, Athenia lived a quiet life in Victor's village, not really doing much. After last year's surprising Victor, the capital wanted more fun Victors like this. This year's Victor was one of the smartest Victors so far in the Ashes files. Although she was super smart, she wasn't the strongest tribute this year, and she got a 6 as her training score due to rewiring an electric circuit. This year's victor was 18-year-old Arsenica Ballander from District 3. Arsenica was a very well-known figure within her district. She's known almost exclusively as one of the smartest girls in her district, performing extraordinarily well in school. When Aphenia arrived in the district, she was so excited to get it over with. She was so excited to get it over with and move on to her home district. As Aphenia made her speech, Arsenica and a few of her friends hummed songs between each other. After the reapings of 13-year-old Wyra Gerard and 12-year-old Kilo Acer, it was time to reap the extra tribute. When Arsenica's name was called, screams were heard from the female reaping enclosures. Peacekeepers forced Arsenica out into the aisle. Arsenica seemed terrified, not ready for the games at all. During the visiting period, Arsenica was visited by her best friend Alexa and her girlfriend Siri. Together, the trio hummed one final tune as a send-off gift to Arsenica. It was also at this time that Alexa admitted that she had feelings for both Arsenica and Siri. Before Alexa and Siri were taken out of the room, Siri and Arsenica agreed to form a throuple with Alexa if Arsenica survived. The girls were then taken out of the room and Arsenica was taken to the train. On the train, Arsenica frowned as she looked at Wyra and Kilo. The pair was crying and Arsenica didn't know what to do. She didn't want to get attached to her district partners, just in case she needed to kill them later on. Eventually, Kilo stopped crying long enough to ask a peacekeeper where their mentor was. This peacekeeper then stated that their mentor was in the capital already and the trio were going to meet him there. During training, Arsenica hung out in the survival station on her own. Here, she learned more survival skills, including how to start a fire. As Arsenica worked in this station, the careers, which were made up of Ravello from 1, Resina from 1, Rex from 2, Zayla from 2, Seraphinus from 2, Shane from 4, Sierra from 4, Xander from 4, Quiver from 7, Samara from 7, Soya from 9, Maverick from 10, and Zamira from 12 came to taunt her. As they taunted her, Arsenica didn't even have to think in order to come up with a comeback to what the careers were saying. This caused the careers to get annoyed and throw one more verbal jab at Arsenica before leaving. During training evaluations, Arsenica rewired a complex electrical circuit. She then wired a button to the electrical circuit and got a safe distance from the electrical circuit and pressed the button, blowing up the electrical circuit. This explosion formed a pit in front of the weapon rack, and that tributes had to jump over in order to use the weapons in their training assessment. A few of the careers missed the jump, causing them to not even be able to get to the weapons. This caused all the careers after Arsenica to have a record low of training scores amongst them, all having gotten somewhere between a 2 and a 6. One of the careers even got below the career average, with Sierra getting a 1. This gave Arsenica a score of 9. The interviews took place the next night, and Arsenica stood backstage wearing a short, tight-fit black dress that perfectly hugged her figure. After the interviews of her district partners, it was Arsenica's turn. As Arsenica stepped foot on the stage, cheers were heard from the crowd of capitalites. As Arsenica's interview went on, she talked about her girlfriend and best friend back at home and how happy both of them made her. At the end of her interview, Arsenica got up out of her chair and walked to the front of the stage, declaring her love for both Siri and Alexa, which caused cheers from the crowd. The next day, the tributes were taken to their lounge rooms underneath the arena. Arsenica was pacing back and forth in her launch room until Clarion showed up. Clarion stated that she should watch out for the careers, saying that after her little stunt during training, she was not well liked by the careers. This caused Arsenica to comment that she wasn't scared of the careers. She then hugged Clarion and stepped into her tube and watched as the glass closed around her. This year's games took place in Trio Towers. The weather was an earthquake, the games lasted for 2 weeks, and the notable mods were killer robots. As the tributes were lifted into the arena, they were met with the sight of 3 large towers. The bottom 5 floors of these towers were a base that connected the 3 towers. Each of the 3 towers had 3 elevators, a north elevator, a south elevator, and a central elevator. When the gong sounded, Arsenica ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a pair of shears and a bottle of water. She then immediately went to run from the cornucopia. As she ran from the cornucopia, she was bumped into by Zamira. Zamira glared down at Arsenica, ready to take her first kill. Just then, Wyra bumped into Zamira, distracting Zamira long enough for Arsenica to run away. When Arsenica ran away, Zamira got so pissed off she just killed Wyra before continuing her killing spree. Arsenica immediately ran into the south elevator in the left tower and used it to get to the top floor. When she got to the top floor, Arsenica set up camp in a separate room. She did wonder why there were shears available in the cornucopia, and it wouldn't be until day 9 that she used it for its intended purpose, but she kept the shears by her side. On day 4, she noticed voices coming from the elevator shaft near her camp. She immediately ducked under a table and looked out at the elevator doors. Just then they opened. Kilo and French from 6 came out of the elevator. The pair talked about where they thought Arsenica was, not knowing she was in the same room. As Arsenica listened in on Kilo and French's conversation, she heard them mention something about the pair of them passing by the careers 15 floors down. After the pair left the floor going up in the elevator, Arsenica started to think more about those shears. Not a lot occurred between day 4 and day 9. Only 5 people died. This is the point, however, that Arsenica finally used the shears in the way she thought they were meant to be used. Arsenica got up and grabbed her shears before walking over to the elevator. Arsenica then waited until one of the elevators closer to the top was moving, before cutting the cord, letting the elevator go into free fall, falling to the ground from the floor just below the top floor, the 99th floor. In that elevator was Samara, Soya, and Sierra. Meanwhile, as she cut the cords to the north elevator, the least used elevator, the tributes that were camping beneath the elevator ended up getting crushed by the elevator. On the dawn of the 12th day, it was down to the top 10. The top 10 included Ravello from 1, Racina from 1, Zella from 2, Arsenica from 3, Zeno from 3, Xander from 4, French from 6, Maverick from 10, Zamira from 12, and Grace from 12. Arsenica stayed in her camp until she heard a scream nearby. This scream was revealed to belong to Grace after she was found and killed by Zamira. The fact that this kill had happened nearby to her own camp, Arsenica was sat upright and at full attention. Just then she heard a whisper from behind her. The whisper belonged to Zeno and made Arsenica jump and turn around fast. Just then, French and Zeno came out from the shadows with slight smirks. Arsenica picked up her shears while Zeno and French took out their knives. Immediately, French threw his knife at Arsenica, but she easily ducked under it, hitting French over the head with her shears. She then glared at Zeno, using her leg to push French down the elevator shaft, sounding his cannon. This caused Zeno to lunge at Arsenica. All she had to do was step to the side, which caused Zeno to run off the edge of the elevator shaft, causing him to fall down too. Zeno's screams could be heard throughout the arena until they were silenced by his cannon sounding due to him hitting the ground. On the dawn of the 14th and final day, it was down to the top three already. The top three consisted of Ravello from 1, Arsenica from 3, and Zamira from 12. On this day, Arsenica figured the game makers were going to try to force the remaining tributes back to the cornucopia to have the final showdown. Just as Arsenica thought this, she felt a rumbling under the ground. She muttered under her breath that it was an earthquake before running towards the stairs and running down them. As she ran down the stairs, upper floors started to crumble as the infrastructure of the building failed. Eventually, the collapsing caught up with Arsenica, causing her to fall 3 levels and break her leg. She was also knocked unconscious under the rubble. When Arsenica woke up, she looked over to her side to see Zamira looking for her after Zamira had killed Ravello. Eventually, before Arsenica had fully woken up, Zamira found her and pulled her out of the rubble with an intense smirk. After pulling Arsenica out, Zamira went on to do her victory speech, talking about how glad she was to be the one to kill Arsenica. Just then, with one good leg, Arsenica kicked Zamira in the crotch. Zamira let go of Arsenica for a second. Only a second, but it was long enough. Arsenica then limped over to her shears and grabbed them, ready to fight back. This caused Zamira to laugh, thinking Arsenica wouldn't even know how to use those shears as weapons. Arsenica then rolled her eyes at this and swung her shears at Zamira, hitting her in the forehead. It wasn't enough to kill her, but it was enough to knock her unconscious. She then used the shears to leave a large cut on Zamira's neck, leaving Arsenica as the victor. After her victory was announced, Arsenica fell to the ground. She then proceeded to look into the sky and watch in order to wait for peacekeepers. When peacekeepers finally arrived, Arsenica went with them without a fuss, just wanting to go home. After her victory, Arsenica was taken to the hospital where it was decided that a victory interview would still be held for Arsenica, thanks to her minor injuries compared to the past few victors. For her victory interview, Arsenica was dressed in the same dress she wore for her tribute interview before the games. Her and Tia talked about how proud Clarion must have been to have finally mentored a victor in this era of Panem. After her victory tour, Arsenica returned home where she and Siri pulled through with their promise, forming a throuple with Alexa. The trio ended up adopting 7 kids together, all of them being girls. The eldest of the 7 would go on to be the last killed tribute in the later games. After last year's smart victor, the Capitol wanted more. This year's victor was surprising, as she didn't get a high training score, only scoring a measly 5 after failing to hit the targets she was shooting her bow and arrow at. This caused her to get kicked out of the Career Alliance, just like Athenia 2 years ago. This year's victor was 18-year-old Anastasia Chavez from District 10. Anastasia was not a very prominent member of her district, living a relatively normal District 10 life. She doesn't really outshine her classmates in the training academy, preferring to fly under the radar. On the day of the reapings, Anastasia stood next to her best friend with a smile on her face. Although the district had been a career district for a few years now, they still hadn't developed their own volunteer ceremony, so it was still just going to the first person to volunteer. After the name of 16-year-old Kat McAllister was picked, Anastasia immediately volunteered in her place. Then, after the name of 12-year-old Beef Saunders was picked, a tall, lanky 18-year-old boy named Wolfmark Saunders volunteered in his place, making him Anastasia's district partner. During the visiting period, Anastasia was visited by her little sister, Minnie. While in the room, all Minnie could do was hug Anastasia and cry. She didn't want Anastasia to go, not understanding why she volunteered, even after Anastasia explained it to her. Eventually, Minnie was escorted out of the room, and Anastasia was escorted onto the train. On the train, Anastasia and Wolfmark waited for their mentors, Briscoe and Antoinette. Antoinette arrived in the main train compartment first, and immediately started the training process with Anastasia. As Antoinette and Anastasia were training, Briscoe did eventually come into the train compartment and started training Wolfmark. During training, Anastasia and Wolfmark hung out with the careers. This year, the careers consisted of Zircon from 1, Zirconia from 1, Wonder from 1, Zeus from 2, Vita from 2, Ulysses from 2, Tide from 4, Viscel from 4, Saw from 7, Sapling from 7, Wolfmark from 10, Anastasia from 10, Nostrum from 12, Liza from 12, and Rose from 12. This group would train together and occasionally joke about the occasional outlier or two. Out of all the outliers, the careers joked Marigold from 11 the worst. Although the 7s, 10s, and 12s didn't say utterly terrible things to her, the ones claimed that Marigold was useless and couldn't do anything right. During training assessments, Anastasia wasn't in the right mindset. Anastasia grabbed the weapon she was best with, but as the 12 targets were brought out, Anastasia panicked. When the targets were brought out, Anastasia started shooting them. She ended up only hitting one target, and she didn't even hit that one in the bullseye. This terrible show of skill gained Anastasia a training score of 5. The interviews took place the next night, and Anastasia stood backstage wearing a beautiful white dress, very reminiscent of a wedding dress. During Zirconia's interview, it was revealed that Anastasia and Sapling had been kicked out of the Career Alliance due to their low training scores. This injustice would not stand with Saw, Wolfmark, Nostrum, Liza, and Rose. All of these people would go on to leave the Career Alliance and form an unspoken alliance with Sapling and Anastasia, which made the girls happy. As Anastasia stepped onto the stage, she was met with cheers and applause. Even after her low training score, she was still one of the favorite tributes this year. As her interviews went on, Anastasia proved herself and made the careers regret kicking her off as she elegantly roasted the careers, saying that Zircon and Zirconia were a couple of fakers, Wonder was a hopeless follower, Zeus and Ulysses were pussies, Zvita and Tide didn't scare her a bit, and that Vassell was her only true competition from the careers. The next day, the tributes were taken to their launch rooms underneath the arena. Anastasia paced back and forth in her room until Antoinette came into the room. She is still laughing after what Anastasia had said during her interview about the careers. Anastasia commented that those comments on the careers might paint a huge target on her back, but she added that the 12s, Wolfmark and Saw, agreed to ally with Anastasia and Sapling. Anastasia replied that she kind of figured that was occurring. Anastasia then entered her tube and watched the glass close around her. This year's games took place in Archipelago. The weather was light raining, the games lasted for 5 days, and the nobleman was a shark. As the tributes were lifted into the water, cheers and whoops could be heard from Tide and Vassell as their eyes met the Archipelago arena. Anastasia tried to keep her composure as her allies looked to her for a plan. When the gong sounded, Anastasia and her allies swam towards the cornucopia with the careers. Anastasia and her allies got to the cornucopia first, surprisingly, but they knew the fours were hot on their tails. Anastasia immediately grabbed a sword and showed the careers yet again that it was a bad idea to kick her out for one bad day by decapitating Zircon and Zirconia in one swing of her sword. Anastasia then ran over to Sapling to help her kill Tide. Together, the girls with the lowest training scores out of the careers took out one of the careers with the highest training scores. After killing Tide, Anastasia and Sapling met up with Saw, who was just finishing killing Wonder. As Anastasia, Sapling, and Saw turned to meet up with the 12s, Vita bumped into them. Before she could do anything, though, Zeus, Ulysses, and Vassell pulled Vita away from the careers. Pulled away, and the careers actually ran away from the cornucopia as Nostrum, Liza, and Rose came to see what was happening. Eventually, Wolfmark also came and met up with the group after having killed the girl from 8. As the group looked around for more bloodbath kills, Liza saw Marigold being attacked by Milstein from 9. Liza immediately told the group of this development, and they surprisingly all ran to help Marigold. As the group was running at Milstein, Anastasia grabbed a throwing knife from Rose's bag and threw it into Milstein's back, causing him to scream in agony and fall off of Marigold, landing on his back, causing the knife to impale him completely. As the group arrived, Milstein was already dead from the throwing knife. This gained a compliment from Rose as she retrieved the knife. As this was happening, Marigold was thinking if she should run or not, until Anastasia offered her hand to help Marigold to her feet. Marigold would gratefully accept this hand and get up with Anastasia's help. After helping Marigold, she agreed to join the group after they had also explained that they were going up against the careers. It was also at this point that Marigold had mentioned that she was allied with the strong Carolina from 6, Detroit from 6, and Loomer from 8. This trio were contenders to be invited into the Career Alliance, but were ultimately decided against during training. This was a perfect chance for Sapling, Saw, Anastasia, Wolfmark, Liza, Rose, and Nostrum to get even more strong tributes into their alliance. The group asked Marigold to lead them to her allies, to which she gratefully accepted and did so without question. When Marigold arrived at where she saw Carolina, Detroit, and Loomer running to, the trio gave Marigold a surprise look. Carolina then used sign language to ask Marigold why the careers were with her. Marigold then explained what happened at the bloodbath to the others. Although it took a while, the trio eventually agreed to join the Anti-Careers, as they called themselves. Although the Anti-Careers existed before now, this was the first time the Alliance gave itself an official name. The 176th, the 179th Hunger Games had the 4s and 7s along with invited outliers. The 180th Hunger Games had the X's and 12s along with their allies. The anti-careers weren't as prevalent in the 181st, the 184th Games, but they were there. The 185th Games had Rhea and her allies. The 186th Hunger Games had Aluma Bates and the Wheelchair Tributes. The 187th Hunger Games had Aphenia and Carmen. The 188th Hunger Games had Zeno and French. Now the 189th Hunger Games had Anastasia and her allies. On the dawn of the fourth day, a record 9 cannons in one sitting went off. These cannons belonged to Vita, Zeus, Ulysses, the trio from 5, both tributes from 3, and the boy from 11. These cannons went off after a huge fight between the careers and the knockoff anti-careers occurred. Vita, Zeus, and Ulysses had killed the girl from 3, the boy from 5, and one of the girls from 5. Vassell then got mad, thinking that these kills rightfully belonged to her, so she killed Vita, Zeus, and Ulysses before killing the boy from 3, the other girl from 5, and the boy from 11. Once Marigold did the math and figured out who was dead, she realized that Vassell killed her district partner, which made her mad. The group then left to find Vassell, Marigold leading the way. After the huge fight, they were already down to the top 13. The top 13 consisted of Vassell from 4, Carolina from 6, Detroit from 6, Sapling from 7, Saw from 7, Loomer from 8, Milietta from 9, Anastasia from 10, Wolfmark from 10, Marigold from 11, Liza from 12, Rose from 12, and Nostrum from 12. On the dawn of the 5th day, the group finally found Vassell. She put up a surprisingly good fight, but was still no match for Anastasia and her clearly larger numbers. After the group killed Vassell, the capital was angry. It was clear here that Vassell was the favorite to win, and that the game makers had been rigging it for her from the start. The anger in the capital caused the game makers to set off an arena event to keep things interesting. In the arena, a shark jumped out of the water, beaching itself close enough to Carolina in order to eat her before sliding back into the water. This scared the rest of the group, and they all started to run. Although they thought the land would be safe, they were about to be proven wrong as poisonous snakes started to make their way towards the group. The scream could be heard in the distance as Milietta also went through this on a different island. The plan was just to kill 4 or 5 tributes, and it was all going according to plan at first. But after 6 people, all from the anti-careers, died, the game makers realized they weren't able to rope the creatures back in remotely. This arena event ended up killing 9 tributes: Carolina from 6, Loomer from 8, Detroit from 6, Liza from 12, Marigold from 11, Nostrum from 12, Rose from 12, Sapling from 7, and Saw from 7. This left the top 3 by the time the game makers could bring the mutts in. The top 3 consisted of Milieta from 9, Anastasia from 10, and Wolfmark from 10. As the final 3 realized they were the final 3 tributes, the trio started to make their way to the cornucopia. When they arrived at the cornucopia, the trio talked to each other for a little while. It was mostly Anastasia and Wolfmark talking about how proud they were of Milieta for getting this far. Milieta then ran at Wolfmark. The pair actually fought for a while, Milieta being surprisingly strong and able to fend for herself. After a few minutes of fighting, Wolfmark finally got the upper hand and sliced Milieta's neck open. After killing Milieta, Wolfmark looked at Anastasia and sighed. Wolfmark then walked over to Anastasia, and a conversation went on between the pair before Wolfmark kissed Anastasia, and the pair then started the fight. In the beginning, both Anastasia and Wolfmark teared up and tried not to cry, but as the fight went on, they just wanted it to be over with. After a few hours of fighting, Anastasia stabbed Wolfmark in the stomach. This caused Wolfmark to double over in pain and fall to the ground. Anastasia then apologized as she stood over Wolfmark. Both people started to actually cry at this point. This caused people in the capital to feel bad for the pair. It was determined that a rule from earlier on in the games would be brought back for these games only. Before Anastasia finished off Wolfmark, President Vesta came onto the intercoms in the arena and announced Anastasia and Wolfmark as this year's victors of the Hunger Games. After their victory was announced, Anastasia stayed by Wolfmark until a hovercraft came to take the pair out of the arena. On the hovercraft, Anastasia and Wolfmark would kiss multiple times, happy they made it out together. After her victory, Anastasia returned home to District 10, where she was celebrated for bringing another victory to District 10. She would eventually marry Wolfmark, and the pair would go on to have 10 children, 8 girls and 2 boys. 2 of these girls would end up competing in the same games, both making it to the top 3 before being killed. Meanwhile, Wolfmark went on to live a quiet life in District 10. He remained in his career as a butcher, remaining as an apprentice of a well-known butcher named Emmerich Wolfstein for 7 years after his victory before being promoted. Unlike Anastasia, since Wolf wasn't an official victor, it was determined by President Vesta that he would not take over the male mentor position. Wolfmark would marry Anastasia almost 10 years after their victory. Although he wasn't allowed to take over the male mentor position, he still joined Anastasia on the train every now and then. When he would do this, he would help the significantly older Briscoe Burnett until they mentored a male victor together during the 3rd century. So yeah, guys, that is the end of today's video. Now, before I show you guys the victory posters, I do want to let y'all know that I made a couple extra posters, one of them for Wolfmark when I decided that I also wanted him to be a victor, and another one for Carmen because I really liked her, so, you know, so there will be a poster for both of those tributes. Over here so we can see the time. Okay, so that is the end of today's video. So yeah, guys, if you guys enjoyed it, then be sure to slap that like button. As always, stay awesome. Goodbye.